This landing is impossible. I'm sorry. Captain Chen's final announcement shattered 203 hearts at 30,000 feet. Boeing engineers confirmed it. F-22 pilots witnessed the catastrophic damage. Every expert agreed, no one survives this. Then an 18-year-old student stood up and walked to the cockpit. What happened next made elite fighter pilots salute her. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 777 shuddered violently at 37,000 feet, and Captain Marcus Chen knew immediately that this was different from any emergency he'd faced in 23 years of flying. The initial hydraulic failure had been manageable, textbook even, until the cascade began. First the backup systems, then the flight computers, then something that should have been impossible, a structural compromise in the tail section that his instruments were screaming about in ways that made his blood run cold. Ground, Apex 2847 declaring emergency, Chen said into his headset, his voice professionally calm despite the chaos erupting across his instrument panel. We've got multiple system failures. Hydraulics are gone, flight computers are intermittent, and we're showing structural damage after the pressure bulkhead. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. The voice that came back from ground control carried an edge of controlled panic. Apex 2847, copy your emergency. Nellis Air Force Base is 40 miles northwest. We're clearing all traffic and scrambling emergency response. Can you maintain current altitude? Chen looked at his first officer, Sarah Rodriguez, whose face had gone pale as she worked through the emergency checklists. The aircraft was responding to control inputs, but sluggishly, unpredictably. Every movement of the yoke felt like he was fighting against physics itself. Negative on altitude hold, Chen responded. We're losing control authority. Beginning descent whether we want to or not. What Chen didn't say, what he was only beginning to comprehend as he processed the data flooding his screens, was that the combination of failures they were experiencing shouldn't be possible. The redundant systems were designed specifically to prevent this exact scenario. Hydraulics, computers, and structural integrity, losing all three simultaneously defied the mathematical models that Boeing engineers had spent decades perfecting. In the cabin, 203 passengers were experiencing that specific kind of terror that comes when smooth routine transforms into lurching chaos. Oxygen masks had deployed, flight attendants were moving through the aisles with forced calm, and the aircraft's violent shuddering made it clear that something catastrophic was happening. Among those passengers, in seat 23F, sat Maya Chen, an 18-year-old woman who most people assumed was just another college student heading home for break. She had her laptop open before the oxygen masks dropped, had been reviewing aerodynamic equations when the first shudder hit. Now, as the aircraft bucked and rolled, she closed her eyes and listened. She wasn't praying. She was analyzing. The vibration frequency in the deck plates told her about the structural damage. The way the aircraft yawed slightly to the left before each correction told her about the hydraulic failures. The rhythm of the engines, still running but working harder than they should, told her about the flight computer problems. And the combination of all three told her something that made her stomach drop. This was it. The scenario her father had died researching. The impossible one. Commander James "Razor" Mitchell was leading a training flight of two F-22 Raptors when the call came through. Razor 1, Nellis Control. We need you to intercept and escort a civilian 777 experiencing multiple emergencies. Vector 270, Angels 35, they're descending rapidly. Mitchell acknowledged and banked his fighter toward the intercept, his wingmen following in perfect formation. As they approached, he could see the commercial aircraft even before his radar painted it clearly. What he saw made him whistle low. Nellis Control, Razor 1 has visual. That tail section. I'm seeing visible structural damage. Significant deformation aft of the horizontal stabilizer route. How are they still flying? Razor 1, they don't know. Their instruments showed damage that should have resulted in catastrophic failure. Boeing engineers on the line are calling it theoretically impossible. Mitchell moved his Raptor closer, close enough to see into the cockpit windows of the stricken airliner. He could see the pilots working frantically. He'd been flying fighters for 15 years, had seen combat, had witnessed things most people couldn't imagine, but watching that massive aircraft barely maintaining controlled flight with visible structural damage made him understand he was watching something unprecedented. Nellis, Razor 1. Based on what I'm seeing, I don't understand how they're maintaining any control authority. That damage pattern should have resulted in complete loss of tail effectiveness. They shouldn't be able to control pitch or yaw with that degree of structural compromise. In the cockpit of Apex 2847, Chen was discovering exactly what Mitchell had just articulated. Every control input was producing unexpected results. The aircraft wanted to roll right, then left, then pitch up unpredictably. The computer systems kept resetting, providing momentary control before failing again. And according to his instruments, the tail structure was flexing in ways that should have already led to complete separation. Sarah, pull up the emergency procedures for combined hydraulic and flight computer failure, Chen ordered. Rodriguez was already there, her fingers flying across the digital displays. Captain, there is no procedure. The checklist assumes we'd have either hydraulics or computers. We don't have either. Not reliably. Chen keyed his radio to ground control. Nellis, Apex 2847. I need Boeing engineering on the line. I need to understand what we're dealing with here. 2 minutes later, a new voice came through, tight with tension. Captain Chen, this is Dr. Howard Mitchell, Boeing Chief Engineering Consultant. I've been reviewing your telemetry data. Captain, I need you to understand something. The combination of failures you're experiencing has never occurred in aviation history. We've run the simulations 1,000 times. The mathematical models indicate that with your current damage pattern, controlled landing is not possible. Chen felt the blood drain from his face. Doctor, I have 203 souls on this aircraft. Tell me there's something we haven't tried. Captain, we're working through every scenario. But you need to understand, the aerodynamic forces at play with that degree of structural compromise, combined with loss of hydraulic authority and intermittent flight computer function, the physics simply don't allow for the kind of precision control you'd need for a safe landing. Every simulation we're running ends in catastrophic structural failure during final approach. The stress loads exceed what the remaining structure can handle. Mitchell's F-22 was now flying formation on the 777's left wing, close enough that he could see the fear in the passengers' faces pressed against the windows. His wingman was on the right side, both Raptors positioned to provide visual assessment and tactical observation. Nellis Control, Razor 1. Request permission to provide direct advisory to Apex 2847. I'm seeing things from out here that their instruments might not be showing accurately. Razor 1, permission granted. Apex 2847, you're cleared for direct communication with your escort fighters. Mitchell switched frequencies. Apex 2847, this is Razor 1 on your left wing. Captain, I can see your tail section from here. The damage is more extensive than you might realize. The entire vertical stabilizer is compromised, and I'm seeing flexing in the horizontal stabilizer structure that should not be happening. I don't know how you're maintaining any directional control. Chen's voice came back, strained but professional. Razor 1, believe me, I'm aware. Every input I'm making is producing unpredictable results. We're 40 minutes from Nellis. Can we make it? Mitchell watched the massive aircraft struggle through the sky, watched the tail section flex and deform with each control input. He'd seen aircraft shot down in combat, had watched fighters try to limp home with battle damage. This was worse. Captain, I'm going to be straight with you. Based on what I'm observing, I don't see how you maintain structural integrity through approach and landing. The stress loads during flare and touchdown. I don't think your airframe can handle it. In the cabin, Maya Chen was listening to every word being transmitted over the aircraft's public address system. The captain had made the decision to keep passengers informed, perhaps believing that honesty was better than false hope. She'd heard the Boeing engineer's assessment. She'd heard the F-22 pilot's evaluation. And she knew something that none of them did. She knew how to land this aircraft. Her father, Captain David Chen, had spent the last 5 years of his life researching exactly this scenario. He'd been a test pilot, but more than that, he'd been obsessed with what he called beyond-envelope recovery. He'd studied every catastrophic failure in aviation history, had used advanced simulation and theoretical aerodynamics to develop procedures for situations that conventional wisdom declared unrecoverable. The aviation authorities had called his work reckless. They'd said he was developing procedures that encouraged pilots to attempt recoveries that should never be attempted, that his research violated fundamental safety principles. When he died during a test flight, attempting to prove one of his theoretical recovery procedures, the aviation community had largely written off his work as the tragic result of dangerous obsession. But Maya had his research notes. She'd studied them obsessively for 3 years, trying to understand what her father had been working toward. She'd used flight simulators to test his procedures, had taught herself aerodynamic engineering to understand his mathematical models. And she'd recognized within minutes of the first system failure that they were experiencing the exact scenario her father had researched most extensively. He'd called it the triple-point failure, the specific combination of structural damage, hydraulic failure, and flight computer malfunction that created an aerodynamically impossible situation. Every conventional procedure would fail. Every simulation ended in catastrophe. But her father's research had identified a theoretical approach, a sequence of control inputs and energy management that exploited the aircraft's remaining capabilities in ways that conventional aviation never considered. The approach was dangerous. It violated every standard procedure. But her father's mathematics suggested it was the only way to survive the impossible. Maya unfastened her seatbelt. The flight attendant immediately moved toward her. "Miss, you need to remain seated with your belt fastened." "I need to speak to the captain," Maya said quietly but firmly. "That's not possible right now. Please sit down." Maya looked directly at the attendant. "My name is Maya Chen. My father was Captain David Chen, test pilot and emergency recovery specialist. I have information about our specific failure pattern that could save everyone on this aircraft. I need to speak to the captain immediately." The attendant hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the desperate situation. "Miss Chen, the cockpit is dealing with an extreme emergency." "I know. That's exactly why I need to speak to them. Please." Something in Maya's eyes, some certainty that transcended her 18 years, made the attendant nod. She picked up the interphone and spoke quietly to the cockpit. 30 seconds later, Maya was being escorted forward, passengers watching her with confused, frightened expressions. Who was this young woman being taken to the cockpit during an emergency? The cockpit door opened and Maya stepped into a scene of controlled chaos. Warning lights flashing, alarms sounding, the captain and first officer working frantically to maintain control of the struggling aircraft. Chen glanced back at her. "You said you have information about our situation?" Maya moved closer, her eyes scanning the instrument panels, immediately understanding the disaster painted across every screen. "Captain Chen, I'm Maya Chen. Captain David Chen was my father." Chen's eyes widened. He knew that name. Every pilot who'd been flying in the last decade knew that name. "Your father, the test pilot?" "Yes. The one who died researching impossible recovery scenarios." Maya's voice was steady. "Captain, I've studied his work. Every note, every simulation, every mathematical model. The failure pattern you're experiencing, structural compromise in the tail section, complete hydraulic failure, intermittent flight computer function, this is what he called a triple-point failure. He spent 5 years researching exactly this scenario." Rodriguez stared at her. "There are no procedures for what we're facing. Boeing engineering just confirmed." Boeing Engineering is using conventional aerodynamic models, Maya interrupted. My father's research went beyond conventional models. He identified that in triple-point failures, conventional approaches fail because they try to maintain standard control authority. But you don't have standard control authority. What you have is a damaged aircraft that's responding to inputs in ways that conventional aerodynamics don't account for. Chen was listening, his hands still on the yoke, feeling the aircraft fight him. Every aviation authority declared your father's work too dangerous. They declared it too dangerous because it requires perfect execution of procedures that violate every safety principle. But Captain, you're facing a situation that every expert is already calling unsurvivable. My father's procedures represent no additional risk beyond a certain crash that conventional wisdom predicts. Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio. Apex 2847, you're drifting off heading. Recommend correction to 275. Chen made the correction, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly, unpredictably. He looked at Maya. Tell me what your father discovered. Maya moved closer to the center console, her fingers pointing to specific indicators. The structural damage in your tail is creating asymmetric aerodynamic forces. Every time you input a correction, you're fighting against those forces using diminished control authority. Conventional procedure says to minimize control inputs, maintain stable flight. But that approach is failing because you're constantly fighting the aerodynamic imbalance. So what's the alternative? Stop fighting it. Use it. Maya's eyes were intense. My father's research showed that in triple-point failures, the asymmetric forces can be exploited. Instead of fighting against the aircraft's tendency to yaw and roll, you work with it. You use the damaged structure's aerodynamic characteristics to create controlled instability. It sounds insane, but the mathematics work. Rodriguez shook her head. Controlled instability? That's a contradiction in terms. Not in extreme damage scenarios, Maya countered. Captain, your aircraft wants to roll right and yaw left. You're fighting that. But if you allow the roll and use it to create a descending spiral, you can bleed energy while maintaining some directional control. Then, during final approach, you use that built-up rotational energy to counter the asymmetric forces during flare. Chen stared at her. That's insane. A descending spiral in a damaged aircraft with passengers? It's controlled energy management, Maya said. And it's the only approach that accounts for your actual damage pattern instead of treating this like a standard emergency. Captain, I can guide you through it. My father's notes detailed every step. I've run this scenario in simulators 100 times. Chen looked at Rodriguez, then at his instrument panel, then at the Nevada desert rising below them. They were 20 minutes from Nellis. Every second, the aircraft was becoming harder to control. Ground control had stopped offering suggestions because there were no suggestions that conventional aviation could provide. Nellis Control, Apex 2847, Chen keyed his radio. I have a passenger in the cockpit, daughter of Captain David Chen. She's proposing an unconventional approach based on her father's research into extreme emergency procedures. Be advised, we're going to attempt a technique that violates standard protocols. There was a long pause from ground control. Then, Apex 2847, we copy. Boeing Engineering advises that conventional approaches have less than 5% probability of successful landing based on your damage pattern. You're cleared to attempt any procedure you believe increases survival probability. Emergency response is standing by. Chen looked at Maya. If we're doing this, we're trusting you completely. You understand that? Maya nodded. I understand. And Captain. I know this seems impossible. But my father proved mathematically that it works. We just need perfect execution. Perfect execution in a damaged aircraft with 203 lives depending on it, Chen said quietly. Then he straightened in his seat. All right. Tell me what to do. Maya took a breath, and suddenly she wasn't an 18-year-old passenger anymore. She was her father's daughter, trained for exactly this moment, carrying forward research that had cost him his life but might now save hundreds. First, we need to establish the descending spiral. Your aircraft wants to roll right. Stop fighting it. Reduce your left aileron input by about 60% and let the aircraft establish a shallow right bank. Aim for 15 to 20 degrees. Chen's training was screaming at him that this was wrong, that allowing an uncontrolled bank in a damaged aircraft was suicide. But his training had also just been declared useless by every expert on the ground. He reduced his control input. The aircraft immediately began rolling right, and several passengers screamed as the wing dipped. But Maya was watching the instruments intently. Good. Now, as the roll develops, use rudder to establish a coordinated turn. You're fighting asymmetric drag from the damaged tail, so you'll need to hold about 40% right rudder. Don't try to stop the roll completely. Just slow it. Chen applied rudder, feeling the aircraft's response. It was wrong, everything about it violated his instincts, but the aircraft was responding. The roll rate decreased, stabilized at 18 degrees of bank. Mitchell's voice came over the radio, urgent. Apex 2847, you're in a banking turn. You need to level the wings. Razor 1, negative, Chen responded. We're attempting a controlled spiral descent. This is intentional. Captain, that's not standard procedure. Razor 1, there is no standard procedure for our situation. We're trying something different. In his F-22, Mitchell watched the massive 777 establish a shallow banking turn, beginning a spiral descent. His military training told him this was wrong, that damaged aircraft shouldn't be intentionally placed into spirals. But as he watched, he realized that the commercial aircraft actually looked more stable in the spiral than it had in straight flight. Nellis control, Razor 1. The 777 has established what appears to be a controlled descending spiral. Unusual tactic, but the aircraft actually seems more stable. Tail section flexing has decreased. Maya was now standing between the pilot's seats, watching multiple displays simultaneously. Captain, your descent rate is 800 feet per minute. We need to increase that to 1200. Lower the nose about 3 degrees. Chen complied, and the aircraft's descent steepened slightly. The spiral continued, the Nevada desert rotating below them as they descended in a constant right turn. This is using gravitational energy to maintain structural stability, Maya explained. The centrifugal force from the turn is creating an outward load that partially counters the asymmetric aerodynamic forces from your damaged tail. It's not elegant, but it's keeping you together. Rodriguez was watching the altimeter spin down. We're passing through 20,000 feet. At this rate, we'll be at pattern altitude in 12 minutes. That's the plan, Maya said. We need to arrive at pattern altitude with enough energy to execute the approach. Captain, your target is 3,000 feet AGL, descending at 1,000 feet per minute, in this right-hand spiral. When we reach 3,000 feet, we'll begin the approach sequence. Chen was starting to understand what Maya's father had discovered. Conventional emergency procedures tried to maintain stable, predictable flight because that's what training emphasized. But with this damage pattern, stable flight was impossible. By accepting the instability and managing it through unconventional techniques, they were actually creating a more controlled situation. Captain, start reducing power now, Maya instructed. We need to bleed energy gradually. Target is 65% N1. Chen pulled the throttles back, feeling the aircraft respond. The spiral continued, smooth and constant, the banking turn creating a hypnotic rotation of the landscape below. Nellis Air Force Base was now visible, the long runways stark white against the brown desert. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway, their lights flashing. Every emergency responder in the region had been called in for what everyone expected to be a catastrophic crash. Apex 2847, Nellis Tower. We have you on radar, descending in a right spiral. Runway 33 left is cleared for emergency landing. Winds 310 at 8 knots. All emergency services are standing by. Nellis Tower, Apex 2847 copies, Chen responded. Be advised, our approach will be unconventional. We'll be maintaining a spiral descent until approximately 1 mile final. There was a pause. Then, Apex 2847, understood. You're cleared for any approach you need to make. The runway is yours. Maya was calculating in her head, watching their position relative to the field. Captain, we're at 6,000 feet, 4 miles from the threshold. Begin a gradual left turn to reverse the spiral. We need to establish a left-hand orbit that will position us for final approach. Left turn? Chen questioned. We've been turning right because that's what the aircraft wants to do. Exactly. And now we're going to use the energy from that right turn to force a left turn. It's going to be hard. The aircraft will fight you. But we need to be on the correct side of the runway for landing. Chen began the left turn, and immediately the aircraft began bucking, the damaged tail creating enormous resistance. Warning lights flashed, the stall warning chirped intermittently. Rodriguez grabbed her armrest as the aircraft shuddered violently. Hold it, Maya said firmly. The aircraft is fighting you, but you're not going to stall. The buffeting is from the asymmetric airflow. Push through it. Chen held the turn, his muscles straining, sweat running down his face. The aircraft was screaming at him through every instrument, every warning system. But gradually, reluctantly, the 777 came around to the left, establishing a mirror image of the right spiral they'd been flying. Good, Maya said. Now we're at 4,000 feet. Continue this left spiral down to 3,000. We need to lose altitude on this side of the field. Mitchell had repositioned his F-22 to observe the entire approach. What he was watching was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The commercial aircraft was descending in a spiral, almost like a fighter in a defensive maneuver, but controlled, deliberate. As a military pilot, he understood unconventional tactics, but this was extreme even by combat standards. Razor 2, are you seeing this? He asked his wingman. Razor 1, affirm. That 777 is flying like a fighter. I don't understand how they're maintaining control. Neither do I. But somehow, they are. Maya watched the altimeter spin down through 3,500 feet. Captain, at 3,000 feet, we're going to roll out of the spiral directly onto final approach heading. This is the critical moment. The aircraft is going to resist violently. You'll need full left aileron, almost full left rudder, and you're going to have to physically force the aircraft level. Won't we stall at that bank angle and low speed? Rodriguez asked. Not if we do it right, Maya said. The energy from the spiral will carry us through the roll. Captain, at 3,000 feet, you're going to command a rapid roll to the left. Don't be gentle. We need aggressive input to overcome the damaged tail's resistance. The altimeter passed through 3,200 feet. The runway was below them now, slightly to the left. One more spiral revolution would put them in position. 3,100. 3,000. Now. Maya commanded. Roll left, hard. Chen threw the yoke to the left, stomping on left rudder, using every ounce of his strength and the aircraft's remaining control authority. The 777 bucked, shuddered, warning systems screaming. The bank angle increased rapidly, 20 degrees, 30, 40, the aircraft rolling out of the spiral. For a terrible moment, it seemed like they would roll inverted. The instruments were a chaos of red warnings. Passengers were screaming. But Chen held the input, and Maya was calling out adjustments. Hold it, ease right aileron now, neutralize rudder, good. The aircraft rolled through level, stopped at 10 degrees left bank, then slowly came level. And suddenly, miraculously, they were pointing at the runway, 3 miles out, at exactly 3,000 feet. Tower, Apex 2847 is established on final, 3 miles, Chen reported, his voice shaking. Apex 2847, runway is yours. Emergency equipment is standing by. Maya wasn't finished. Captain, this is where my father's research becomes critical. Conventional approach says to maintain steady descent. We can't do that. The tail damage creates varying lift at different speeds and angles. We need to use dynamic energy management. What does that mean? Chen asked, still stunned that they'd survived the spiral and rollout. It means we're not going to fly a smooth glide slope. We're going to descend in pulses. Small power adjustments, coordinated with pitch changes. We're going to ride the aerodynamic instabilities like a surfer rides waves. The aircraft will oscillate, but we'll control the oscillations. Rodriguez shook her head. This is insane. It's physics, Maya corrected. Captain, reduce power to 50% N1. Let the nose drop naturally. Don't force it down. Chen reduced power, and the nose dropped. The aircraft descended rapidly, too rapidly. Then Maya called out, power back to 70%, slight back pressure. Chen complied, and the aircraft's descent slowed, almost stopped, then began descending again as Maya called for another power reduction. Mitchell was watching from his escort position. Nellis, Razor 1. The 777 is flying the most unusual approach I've ever seen. They're porpoising down final, but it's controlled. They're actually maintaining the centerline perfectly. On the ground, Boeing engineers were watching telemetry data in stunned disbelief. The aircraft should have stalled 3 times by now. The tail structure should have failed during that aggressive rollout. The approach profile violated every guideline. But somehow, impossibly, the 777 was maintaining controlled flight. 2 miles, Rodriguez called out. Maya's instructions came faster now. Power to 60%, ease forward pressure, back to 75%, slight left rudder for drift correction, power to 55%. Chen was operating on pure trust now, executing her commands without questioning, because they were working. Each power change, each control input was being called at exactly the right moment, accounting for factors his training had never addressed. 1 mile. 500 feet, Rodriguez said. The runway was rushing up at them. Emergency vehicles were positioned along both sides. Through the windscreen, Chen could see firefighters and medical personnel watching the struggling aircraft approach. Captain, this is the critical phase, Maya said, her voice calm despite the tension. The flare. Conventional technique says to begin flare at 50 feet, raise the nose gradually. We can't do that. The damaged tail doesn't provide enough elevator authority for a conventional flare. Then how do we land? Chen asked, the runway now filling their windscreen. We're going to use a technique my father called a drop flare. We're going to descend at a higher rate than normal, then at 20 feet, you're going to command maximum elevator input, maximum power, and literally yank the nose up. The aircraft will pitch up violently, bleed speed, and drop onto the runway. It's going to feel like a crash. But it's controlled. You're telling me to intentionally stall the aircraft at 20 feet? I'm telling you to use the aircraft's remaining energy to create one moment of nose-high attitude that will break your descent rate. Trust the math, Captain. They were at 200 feet, descending rapidly. Too rapidly for any normal approach. 150 feet. 100 feet. The runway was right there, the white markings clear and sharp. 50 feet. Hold your descent, Maya commanded. Don't start the flare yet. Chen's training was screaming at him. Every instinct demanded he start the flare now, that they were going to slam into the runway. But he held the descent. 30 feet. 25 feet. 20 feet. Now. Full back pressure. Maximum power. Pull. Chen yanked the yoke back and shoved the throttles forward simultaneously. The aircraft's nose pitched up violently, the engine spooled up to maximum thrust. For one impossible moment, the 777 seemed to hang in the air, nose high, rate of descent broken by pure force and timing. Then gravity reasserted itself. The main landing gear contacted the runway with a tremendous impact that would have made any normal landing unacceptable. But this wasn't a normal landing. The gear held, the tires screeched, and the nose dropped heavily onto the nose gear. Chen immediately deployed reversers and thrust reversers screamed to life. He stood on the brakes, feeling the aircraft shudder and shake as the damaged structure protested the landing loads. But they were on the ground. They were on the runway. They were slowing. The 777 rolled down the runway, trailing smoke from the brakes, the damaged tail section flexing but holding. Emergency vehicles raced alongside, ready for the worst. But the worst didn't come. The aircraft slowed more, and finally came to a complete stop on the runway, 2/3 of the way down the 12,000-foot concrete strip. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. Then the radio exploded with voices. Ground control, emergency services, Boeing engineers, military observers, everyone trying to speak at once, asking if they were okay, expressing disbelief that the landing had been successful. Mitchell's F-22 flew low over the runway, and then something unprecedented happened. He brought his fighter to a near stall, rocked his wings in salute, and transmitted, Apex 2847, Razor 1. That was the most extraordinary piece of flying I've ever witnessed. You just accomplished what every expert said was impossible. His wingman followed suit, performing the same salute maneuver. Then, still flying escort position as the 777 sat motionless on the runway, both F-22 pilots rendered formal military salutes in their cockpits, a gesture of profound respect normally reserved for fallen comrades or extraordinary acts of heroism. Apex 2847, Mitchell transmitted, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm not sure who was flying that aircraft, but they just demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything in military aviation. Request permission to meet that crew after you've evacuated." Chen finally found his voice. Razor 1, Apex 2847. The person you want to meet is standing right here. Her name is Maya Chen. She's 18 years old, and she just saved 203 lives using techniques her father died developing. On the ground, as emergency crews surrounded the aircraft and passengers began evacuating down the emergency slides, Maya stood in the cockpit, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear or relief, but of complicated grief and vindication. Her father had been right. The controversial research that aviation authorities had condemned, the procedures they'd called too dangerous, the techniques that had cost him his life, they worked. They just saved everyone on this aircraft. Rodriguez touched her shoulder gently. "How did you know? How could you possibly know that would work?" Maya wiped her eyes. "My father spent 5 years studying this exact scenario. He used advanced aerodynamic modeling, ran thousands of simulations. He knew conventional approaches failed because they tried to maintain conventional control. His research proved that in extreme damage situations, you had to accept the impossibility and work with it rather than against it." Chen was already on the radio with Boeing Engineering. "Ground, Apex 2847. I need you to understand something. The landing you just witnessed wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't even close. We used techniques developed by Captain David Chen, techniques that aviation authorities rejected. But those techniques just proved themselves. This needs to be studied. This needs to be validated." Outside, as passengers gathered on the runway, dazed but alive, emergency personnel began checking them for injuries. Incredibly, despite the violent approach and hard landing, there were only minor injuries, a few broken bones from passengers not properly braced, some bruises and cuts. But everyone was alive. All 203 souls survived a landing that every expert had declared mathematically impossible. Mitchell landed his F-22 and immediately drove to the parked 777. He found Maya sitting on the runway beside the massive aircraft, staring up at the damaged tail section. He approached in his flight suit, helmet under his arm, and stood beside her. Maya Chen. She looked up at this F-22 pilot, this elite warrior. Yes. Mitchell came to attention and rendered a formal military salute. Ma'am, I've been flying fighters for 15 years. I've seen combat, I've trained with the best pilots in the world. What you accomplished today exceeds anything I've ever witnessed. Your father would be incredibly proud. Maya stood, returning his salute awkwardly. My father died trying to prove these techniques worked. Everyone said he was reckless, that his research was dangerous. Your father was a pioneer, Mitchell said firmly. Sometimes pioneering work costs lives before it saves them. But today, his research saved 203 people. And speaking as someone who watched from escort position, I can tell you that what I witnessed violated everything I thought I knew about aviation. You didn't just land that aircraft. You flew it in ways that should be impossible. You proved that impossible just means beyond what current training attempts. Chen and Rodriguez emerged from the aircraft, and Chen approached Maya. He stood before this 18-year-old woman who just saved his passengers, his crew, and himself. I don't know how to thank you, he said simply. I don't know if words even exist for what you did. Maya looked at him, and finally smiled slightly. My father used to say that aviation would eventually face scenarios where conventional wisdom failed. He said that when the impossible becomes real, you need procedures that account for impossibility. Today was that scenario. The Boeing engineers arrived by helicopter within the hour. They examined the aircraft, reviewed the telemetry data, interviewed Chen and Rodriguez about the exact procedures used. What they discovered stunned them. The tail section should have failed during the spiral descent. The structure should have collapsed during the aggressive rollout. The aircraft should have stalled during the drop flare landing. But mathematical analysis of the actual flight data showed that Maya's procedures had worked by exploiting aerodynamic effects that conventional models didn't account for. The spiral descent had used centrifugal force to stabilize damaged structure. The rollout had used rotational energy to overcome control limitations. The drop flare had used the aircraft's mass and the timing of control inputs to create momentary control authority that physics models said shouldn't exist. Captain David Chen's controversial research was vindicated. His procedures were unconventional, dangerous, and violated every standard protocol. But they worked when nothing else could. Within days, the aviation community was debating what happened over Nevada. Some called for Maya's father's research to be studied and incorporated into emergency training. Others insisted that the procedures were too dangerous, that they required perfect execution beyond what could be expected from pilots in emergency situations. But everyone agreed on one thing: an 18-year-old woman had accomplished what every expert declared impossible. She'd taken her father's controversial research, applied it with perfect precision, and saved 203 lives in the process. The F-22 pilots salute became legendary in military aviation circles. It represented something profound, elite warriors acknowledging that they'd witnessed achievement exceeding their own capabilities, that someone barely out of high school had demonstrated aviation skills that surpassed what their extensive training had prepared them for. Mitchell later wrote in his official report, "I have witnessed exceptional flying throughout my military career. I have seen skilled pilots recover from situations that would defeat most aviators. But what I observed on this date transcends skill. This was the perfect application of theoretical procedures under impossible conditions." The pilot, and I use that term with full respect despite her lack of official certification, demonstrated capabilities that our military training does not address. She earned my salute not through military achievement, but through human achievement that exceeded military standards. For Maya, the aftermath was complicated. She became famous overnight, her name in every news outlet, aviation forums debating her actions, schools requesting her to speak about courage and perseverance. But she carried the weight of her father's death alongside the vindication of his work. 6 months after the landing, she was invited to speak at a gathering of test pilots and aviation engineers. She stood before hundreds of experienced aviators, many of whom had initially dismissed her father's research, and spoke from her heart. My father died proving that impossible is sometimes just a label we apply to things we haven't figured out yet. His research was called dangerous because it pushed beyond conventional limits. But here's what I learned that day over Nevada: every advance in aviation came from someone willing to challenge what everyone else said was impossible. The Wright brothers were told human flight was impossible. Breaking the sound barrier was considered impossible. Landing on the moon was impossible. She paused, looking out at the assembled pilots. My father's research wasn't about being reckless. It was about preparing for the moment when all the conventional procedures fail, when the textbook scenarios don't account for the reality you're facing. He knew that someday, someone would face a triple-point failure. And he wanted whoever faced it to have a chance. That's what pioneers do. They prepare for impossibilities so that when those impossibilities become real, people can survive them. The audience gave her a standing ovation. More importantly, the FAA announced that they would be conducting a comprehensive review of Captain David Chen's research, with the possibility of incorporating elements into advanced emergency procedures training. 2 years later, Maya enrolled in a prestigious aeronautical engineering program. But she also earned her pilot's license, training in the same aircraft her father had flown. She would eventually become a test pilot herself, continuing her father's work on beyond-envelope recovery procedures. The 777 that she landed was retired from service, its damaged structure too compromised for repair. But the FAA preserved the tail section as a training exhibit, a reminder of what had been accomplished. They mounted a plaque that read, "This aircraft experienced a triple-point failure on date." Conventional aviation wisdom declared controlled landing impossible. Maya Chen, age 18, proved otherwise through application of pioneering recovery procedures developed by Captain David Chen. All 203 passengers and crew survived. Impossible is not a limit. It's an invitation to find new solutions. Captain Marcus Chen continued flying for another decade before retiring. He never experienced another emergency of that magnitude, which he considered a blessing. But he kept in contact with Maya, and years later, when she graduated as a test pilot, he attended the ceremony. "You saved my life," he told her. "You saved my passengers. But more than that, you taught me that expertise can come from unexpected places, that an 18-year-old with the right knowledge and perfect timing can accomplish what veteran pilots and military experts said couldn't be done. You changed how I think about aviation, about training, about what's possible." Mitchell, the F-22 pilot, also stayed in touch with Maya. He eventually left military service and became a civilian aviation safety consultant. His experiences observing Maya's landing influenced his entire approach to safety analysis. "The military teaches us to operate within defined parameters," he explained in a presentation years later. "We have flight envelopes, performance limits, operational boundaries. But Maya taught me that sometimes survival requires operating outside those boundaries. Not recklessly, but deliberately, with full understanding of the physics and aerodynamics involved." Her father's research represented a whole field of study that conventional aviation ignored because it seemed too dangerous. But ignoring it meant being unprepared when the impossible happened. The other 201 passengers went on with their lives, forever marked by having survived what should have been unsurvivable. Many sent letters to Maya over the years, thanking her, sharing how they'd changed their lives after being given a second chance. Some became pilots themselves, inspired by her story. Others simply lived with renewed appreciation for each day. One passenger, a retired mathematics professor, spent months analyzing the flight data and Maya's father's research papers after the incident. He published a paper in a prestigious journal titled "Nonlinear Aerodynamic Solutions to Conventionally Impossible Flight Scenarios." The paper vindicated Captain David Chen's mathematical models and proposed that aviation training should include preparation for scenarios outside normal flight envelopes. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the aviation industry itself. The incident forced a reckoning with the assumption that current training covered all necessary scenarios. The FAA established a new research division focused on beyond-envelope emergency procedures, directly inspired by Captain David Chen's work and Maya's successful application of his techniques. Within 5 years, elements of those procedures were incorporated into advanced pilot training. Not the extreme techniques Maya had used, those still required specific damage patterns and were considered last resort measures, but the underlying philosophy, that in extreme emergencies, unconventional approaches might be necessary, and pilots should be mentally prepared to attempt techniques outside standard procedures. The debate about Captain David Chen's legacy continued for years. Some argued that his research encouraged dangerous experimentation. Others pointed out that his daughter had used his research to save hundreds of lives. Both perspectives had merit, but the undeniable fact remained: when the impossible scenario he'd spent years studying actually occurred, his procedures worked. Maya eventually married another test pilot and had children of her own. She told them stories about their grandfather, not just about his death, but about his passion for solving problems that others considered unsolvable, his dedication to making aviation safer even when others didn't understand his methods, his belief that love could be expressed through technical research that might save lives decades later. On the 20th anniversary of the landing, Maya returned to Nellis Air Force Base for a ceremony. Mitchell was there, now gray-haired but still carrying himself with military bearing. Captain Chen, retired and using a cane, attended as well. The FAA had erected a permanent memorial at the base, honoring both Captain David Chen's pioneering research and Maya's perfect execution of his techniques. Standing before the memorial, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her from overlooked teenager to honored figure whose achievement had changed aviation. She thought about her father, about those final years when he'd obsessively prepared her for scenarios that everyone else said would never happen. She thought about the moment in that aircraft when she'd realized that his research, his sacrifice, had prepared her for exactly the crisis they were facing. Mitchell stood beside her. "You know what I remember most clearly," he said. "Flying formation on that 777, watching it perform maneuvers that should have been impossible. I remember thinking, someone in that cockpit understands something I don't." Turned out to be an 18-year-old whose father had spent years studying the one scenario everyone else ignored. He knew, Maya said quietly. He knew that someday, someone would face a triple-point failure. He didn't know it would be me, didn't know I'd be the one to use his research. But he prepared me anyway, just in case. That's love, Mitchell said. Preparing someone for an impossibility that might never happen, just so they'll be ready if it does. Maya nodded, tears in her eyes. Every time he made me practice those procedures in the simulator, every time he walked me through the mathematics, every time he explained why conventional approaches failed, he was loving me forward. He was making sure that if I ever faced the impossible, I'd have the tools to survive it. The ceremony concluded with a flyover, not of current F-22s, but of a restored vintage fighter that had been part of her father's test operations. As it passed overhead, wings rocking in salute, Maya understood something profound about her journey. Her father had died chasing impossibility. But through his death, through his research, through his love expressed in technical preparation, he'd given her the ability to accomplish what others declared couldn't be done. He'd turned impossibility into survival, tragedy into triumph, controversial research into life-saving procedure. And in doing so, he'd proved something fundamental about human potential, that with enough dedication, enough love, enough willingness to explore beyond conventional boundaries, the impossible becomes possible. Not easy. Not simple. But possible. 203 people were alive because a father had loved his daughter enough to prepare her for impossibilities. Because a daughter had loved her father enough to honor his controversial research by studying it obsessively. Because when the moment came, when every expert said there was no hope, an 18-year-old woman had trusted her father's legacy and executed procedures with perfect precision. The F-22 pilot's salute had honored all of that, the achievement, the preparation, the love, the vindication. It had acknowledged that sometimes the greatest accomplishments come from unexpected places, from young people carrying forward their parents' unfinished work, from perfect execution of procedures that conventional wisdom rejected. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows across the memorial, Maya placed her hand on the plaque bearing her father's name. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "Your research worked. You were right all along." And somewhere in that desert evening, in the physics that had saved 203 lives, in the procedures that had turned impossibility into survival, Captain David Chen's legacy lived on, pioneering, controversial, and ultimately vindicated by his daughter's perfect landing that had made even elite warriors salute in recognition of achievement beyond their own capabilities. The impossible had become possible. And it would continue inspiring aviators for generations, proving that love, dedication, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom could overcome any obstacle, survive any emergency, and accomplish what everyone else declared could not be done.